Let's talk about inflation. And in particular, let's look at a real important instance of a peak, a spike in inflation, and that's what happened in the COVID-19 crisis. That, of course, started when COVID was discovered in 2019, the end of 2019, and its effects hit most of the world's economies in 2020. What happened was that because of the spread of the bug and the deaths that were associated with it, governments throughout the world essentially shut down a lot of their economies. People were ordered to stay at home, not to mix socially. Some people were given permission to continue working in important emergency jobs. Others worked from home, were laid off, or were kept on but really couldn't work as efficiently as they had before. So the economy contracted. In the USA, initially about 10% was wiped off of GDP, and it was a similar story in the UK and indeed in many other countries. Now, what were economists doing while this happened? Well, they were predicting that the effects to GDP, and for that matter to unemployment, would soon be over and that the economy would bounce back. And in that, they turned out to be, on the whole, correct. On the other hand, they did not expect inflation to rise to any significant degree, and in that, they were completely wrong. In fact, GDP, as we said, went down initially by about 10%, but fairly quickly bounced back. Unemployment spiked up at around the sort of 15% levels, and then again, fairly rapidly dropped back again. But inflation went up by 2021-22 to hit peaks in both the UK and the USA of about 8% per year, which was an enormous increase over the roughly 2% that we had before COVID. So, why couldn't economists predict this inflationary effect? Well, there are lots of reasons for that, but largely they're tied to the sort of models they were using. And in previous videos on this channel, we've discussed the great problems that exist around current macroeconomic models, in particular their inability to predict things like business cycles, and it turns out inflation in times of change is another of these things that current economic models are just not good at predicting, and the reason for that is largely because they're based on false assumptions about how people behave. Let's look in the early stages of the COVID crisis at what was actually being forecast by most economists and most independent economic forecasters. So here we're going to show a few graphs and a table from the USA Congressional Budget Office, which is an official body that does forecasts, including inflation, unemployment, GDP. And if we look at this one, which is the unemployment rate, you can see that it has just spiked at around 16% and is on its way down. And that was a correct forecast. Another one of their predictions, which is the real output, that's essentially GDP, went down to a bottom of about 12% and then was predicted to increase back up close to original levels, and again that turned out to be roughly right. Inflation, on the other hand, you can see in this graph, they predicted that it was going to go down and stay down for quite a considerable time, even below the 2% that had been there before the COVID crisis struck, and that's absolutely wrong. These forecasts from the Congressional Budget Office were not outliers, they weren't strange in some way or governmentally influenced, and in this table here you can see the comparison that they themselves showed against other forecasters, and you can see that in fact other forecasters were largely in line with these sort of predictions. Again, correct for unemployment, correct for GDP, but wildly wrong for inflation. In fact, the predictions of inflation were so bad that in the UK, the Bank of England had to commission a report from Ben Bernanke in 2023, essentially to explain why they'd done such a bad job at forecasting inflation. And Ben Bernanke came in, had a look at their systems, made several technical recommendations, a wider range of models, relying on different sorts of expertise. So this report suggested fiddling around and slightly expanding the range of models that are used by the Bank of England, but essentially it avoided the real problem. And the real problem is that the sort of models that are being used are basically not really fit for purpose. They don't work well when you've got a big change in the economy. They only work well when the economy is going along in a fairly smooth way. But of course at that point it's very easy to predict inflation. It's not going to change much. It's only when the economy is hit with big changes that we really need advance warning of big changes in inflation, and that's exactly when these standard models don't work. Now, in this series of videos we've explained several times about the so-called SHD model, which is based entirely on more realistic, heuristic behaviours of individuals in economies, on the assumption that they take decisions based on what's happening now or what's happened in the recent past, not, as many current economic models assume, on assumptions about what might happen in the indefinite future, and that they're driven by confidence, by animal spirits to make their spend and invest decisions rather than by anything more complex, abstract or mathematical. Now, what we're going to do is use this model to see whether it would have predicted inflation well at the onset of the COVID crisis. Now, in order to do this, we will have to model the shocks that the COVID crisis saw. Well, let's look at the USA and see the size of the shocks that were involved there. Essentially, there were two elements to the shock. One was unemployment, and in the USA, over the COVID period, unemployment peaked at around 15-16% on a monthly basis in 2020, but by the end of the year it had fallen back to around 7%. So to model this, we're just going to say let's take an average of about a 10% increase in unemployment during 2020. The other part of the shock was spending. Because there was unemployment, because people were not able to go out and mix and socialise in their normal ways, a lot of spending was clamped down upon. And in fact, in the USA, spending initially fell by around 17% again, but quickly recovered to only around 3.5% by the end of the year. So we'll model that loss of spending by something like a 5% decrease in spending in 2020. Now, the other half of the picture is that after 9 months or so, the governments reacted and brought in spending stimulus. Now, in the USA, there was about a 2.8 trillion US dollar stimulus applied. Acts were passed in December of 2020 and March of 2021, and we also saw that public debt rose from around 105% of GDP pre-COVID to 126% of GDP in 2020. So these sort of figures suggest that the stimulus applied was in the region of 15 to 20% of USA GDP in 2021. So that's what we will take. We will take a figure of 15% of GDP being applied 1 year after the shocks in 2020, stimulus in 2021. And in the model outputs we're going to show that corresponds to the shocks occurring in the model's period 21, followed by the stimulus being applied in the model's period 22. So what happens? Is this model any better at predicting inflation under these sorts of economic shocks? Well, let's first of all look at GDP. Now, of course, we know that the classical models were reasonably good at predicting what would happen to GDP, but let's just look to see what the SHD model does. So, first of all, here is a picture of what happens to GDP in this model economy if there's no COVID, no shocks, no stimulus. And what happens is that the economy grows over time, gradually, and you can see there's a couple of dips. There are two business cycle recessions which appear during that period. If we then introduce the COVID-style shocks in period 21, we see that the GDP then immediately drops, and it does slowly recover, but even 10 years after the shock, the end of the graph shown, we see that the level of GDP is still under what it would have been without any COVID shocks. So the COVID shocks have a long-term effect on GDP. Finally, if we not only introduce the shocks in period 21, but also the stimulus in period 22, then we get this picture where, again, we can see that immediately on the receipt of the shocks, the GDP drops, but now it recovers much more quickly, and indeed by the end of this 10-year period after the shocks, the level of GDP has risen basically back up to what it was without any shocks. So the stimulus does a good job in helping the economy recover more quickly and to return to pre-COVID growth levels. Okay, that's the GDP side, and that's really what we'd expect and what indeed other models did expect and predict. But now let's turn to inflation, which is the big question. Again, let's look in three parts. First of all, what happens according to the model to inflation if there's no COVID, no shocks, no stimulus. And we can see here that what happens is that apart from those two recession dips, we find that inflation goes along at a pretty steady rate of just under 2%, and then it dips down to about nothing at those recession points. That's good. That's the sort of 2% level is what central banks typically like to target. Now, if we apply the COVID shocks, we find in period 21 that the initial reaction is a small deflation, but then that's immediately followed by quite a big rebound with inflation jumping up to a peak of 5%, and that peak then slowly disappears over the next few years. Why is that? That's because, to begin with, there's that drop in spending, but then that means there's essentially spare money left to spend, and that is spent in the succeeding periods, and that means that that extra money to spend pushes the prices up. Okay, what happens in the complete picture when we not only have the spending shocks, but we then, in the following period, period 22, apply the stimulus? Well, there you can see that the picture is that essentially we have this flat inflation of around 2% for a long time, and then suddenly there's a big 8% spike in inflation, which very quickly comes back down, and the economy returns to the original 2% level. And that is, of course, pretty much the pattern that we actually saw during the COVID crisis. So this model seems much better able to predict inflation than the array of economic models which were being used by banks, central banks, and by independent economic forecasters during the COVID period. In fact, if we superimpose over that period the actual USA inflation with the predictions of the model. The predictions here of the model are shown in red, and the actual COVID inflation in the USA is shown in blue. You can see that, in fact, although the actual inflation rises and falls slightly more sharply than the model predicts, essentially the overall shape, the overall pattern is the same. So, this is only one example, but it is a real example, and it's the sort of thing that models need to be able to deal with. If models can't give accurate predictions in times of big economic change, they're really not worth the paper they're written on. So this suggests forecasters should either replace or at the very least supplement their existing sort of economic models with these more realistic, behaviorally heuristic-based models which actually mirror real behavior far more accurately than existing ones can.